Four men walked into a small San Francisco barbershop with one goal in mind. They thought they were confronting an ordinary customer waiting his turn in a worn vinyl chair. What they found instead, 60 seconds later, was something none of them ever spoke about again. Not to each other, not to the police, not to anyone who asked why two of them walked out of that shop holding their arms at strange angles. This is the story of a Tuesday afternoon in 1968, a case of mistaken identity and the 60 seconds that became the most carefully avoided topic in a small San Francisco neighborhood for years afterward. The barbershop was called Vincent's, a narrow two-chair operation on a quiet block that had been run by the same family for 18 years. It was the kind of shop that existed primarily for the neighborhood it served, regulars who came every 2 weeks, conversations that picked up exactly where they had left off, a radio that played the same station every day because nobody had ever suggested changing it. Vincent Russo was 61 years old and had cut hair in that chair for most of his adult life. He knew most of his customers by name, by occupation, and usually by the specific small troubles currently occupying their lives, because a barbershop is one of the few places where men of that era said things out loud that they said almost nowhere else. On the Tuesday in question, he had 2 customers in his shop. One was in his chair, getting a trim he didn't urgently need, but had scheduled out of habit. The other was waiting, a young man who had walked in 20 minutes earlier, said he had some time before an appointment to cross town, and asked if he could sit until it was his turn. Vincent had said of course, the way he said it to anyone. The young man had taken a seat near the window, a small bag at his feet, and had been reading a folded newspaper with the unhurried patience of someone entirely comfortable waiting. He gave his name as Lee. Vincent didn't think much of it. It was a common enough name, and the shop saw enough faces in a week that Vincent had long since stopped trying to remember everyone who wasn't a regular. The 4 men came in at 2:40 in the afternoon. Vincent recognized one of them, a local named Sal Petrocelli, who occasionally got his hair cut at the shop, and who, Vincent knew from neighborhood conversation, had been in an escalating dispute over money with another man in the area. The dispute had apparently reached the point that Sal had decided a direct confrontation was necessary, and he had brought 3 friends along for the kind of confrontation where numbers matter more than words. The problem, which became apparent within about 10 seconds of the 4 men entering the shop, was that Sal had the wrong barbershop, the wrong afternoon, or the wrong man, possibly some combination of all 3. The man he was looking for, according to what Vincent pieced together afterward from fragments of the brief and confusing exchange that followed, was supposed to be waiting in a shop 2 blocks over, sitting by a window, waiting, having told someone he'd be there around that time. A young Asian man, sitting by a window, waiting. Sal Petrocelli looked at the young man reading a newspaper near Vincent's front window and made an assumption that would occupy approximately the next minute of his life and several subsequent years of his memory. He said something, Vincent didn't catch the exact words, something about money owed and time being up, and the young man lowered his newspaper and looked at him with an expression of genuine, uncomplicated confusion. He said he wasn't sure who Sal was talking about. He said he was simply waiting for an appointment. This should have ended it. In most versions of this kind of mistaken confrontation, a moment of clarification resolves the situation. Apologies are exchanged or not exchanged, and everyone goes about their day having narrowly avoided an unnecessary incident. This was not most versions. Sal Petrocelli, already keyed up from the anticipated confrontation he'd been building toward on the walk over, and surrounded by 3 friends who had come specifically to back him up, did not process the confusion as a sign he had the wrong man. He processed it as evasion. He took a step closer. Vincent, mid-haircut with his other customer, set down his scissors.
He said, in the firm but careful tone of a shop owner who has had to defuse exactly this kind of situation before, that whatever business they had, it wasn't going to happen in his shop. He said the young man had been sitting there for 20 minutes waiting his turn, and he didn't know what Sal was talking about, and maybe everyone should take a breath. One of Sal's 3 companions, a heavy-set man Vincent didn't recognize, told Vincent to mind his own business in a tone that made clear the suggestion wasn't optional. The young man by the window had not stood up. He had set the newspaper down on the small table beside him, folding it once, the unhurried movement of someone tidying up rather than preparing for anything. His expression, Vincent said later, had not shifted into anything resembling alarm. It had simply become more attentive, the specific quality of someone who has stopped reading and started paying close attention to something else. Sal reached for him. What happened next, occupied by every account given afterward by the people present, somewhere between 50 and 70 seconds, a window of time that everyone agreed was short and that nobody, despite having been 3 feet away from it, could fully reconstruct in sequential detail. What Vincent remembered clearly was this: Sal's hand never completed the motion it started. The young man had moved, not dramatically, not with any visible effort, and Sal's reach found the back of an empty barber chair instead of the shoulder he had been aiming for. Sal, carried forward by his own committed momentum, stumbled into the chair and knocked over a tray of combs and clippers that scattered loudly across the tile floor. The heavy-set man who had told Vincent to mind his own business moved next, faster than Sal had, with the kind of practiced aggression of someone who had been in this position before and knew how to close distance quickly. He also did not reach his target. Vincent's other customer, still sitting in the barber chair with a cape around his shoulders and half a haircut completed, said afterward that what struck him most was the quiet. Not silence exactly. There was the sound of the falling tray, the scrape of shoes against tile, someone's sharp exhale, but an absence of the kind of noise he expected from 4 men attempting to overwhelm one. No shouting, no prolonged struggle. Just brief, specific sounds, each one quickly followed by something hitting a surface that wasn't a person. The 3rd man didn't get close enough to make contact at all. He had hesitated at the doorway, watching his 2 friends fail to connect with someone who didn't seem to be doing anything dramatic to avoid them, and his hesitation cost him whatever window of opportunity might have existed. By the time he decided to commit, Sal was on the floor next to the overturned tray, and the heavy-set man was bent over near the 2nd chair, one arm held against his body at an angle that made clear something in his shoulder had been firmly and efficiently relocated. The 4th man had never come fully through the door. He was standing in the entrance, watching, and what he watched in those final 15 seconds was enough to make the decision for him. The young man, Lee as Vincent had known him for 20 minutes, was standing near the window exactly where he had been sitting, the small bag still at his feet, his breathing unhurried. He looked at the man in the doorway for a moment.
He said nothing. The man in the doorway turned and left. The 3rd man, who had hesitated and never committed, helped Sal to his feet, and they both moved toward the door with the particular speed of people who had collectively decided that whatever this had been, it was over, and they wanted no further part of it. The heavy-set man followed last, still holding his arm, saying nothing to anyone. Within 90 seconds of the 4 men entering the shop, all 4 were gone. Vincent stood in the middle of his shop, looking at the scattered combs and the overturned tray and the slightly dented barber chair that Sal had stumbled into. His other customer sat very still under the cape, his half-finished haircut forgotten. The young man bent down, picked up several of the scattered combs from the floor, and set them back on the tray with the same unhurried care he had folded his newspaper with a minute earlier. He looked at Vincent and said he was sorry for the mess. Vincent said it wasn't his mess to be sorry about. The young man said he hoped Vincent's afternoon wasn't too disrupted. He picked his newspaper back up, sat back down near the window, and resumed reading, as though the previous 90 seconds had been a minor and already concluding interruption to an otherwise uneventful wait. Vincent finished his other customer's haircut with hands that he admitted years later were not entirely steady for the first few minutes. When he finished, the young man's appointment time had apparently arrived because he stood, thanked Vincent, paid for nothing because he'd received no service, and left. Vincent never learned his full name that day. It was only months later, seeing a magazine photograph in connection with a martial arts demonstration being written about in a local paper, that he recognized the face and put together who had been sitting in his shop reading a newspaper on a Tuesday afternoon. He told his wife he did not tell his regular customers. This was a deliberate decision, and Vincent was explicit about it in the rare conversations where the subject came up decades later. He said that telling the story properly would have required explaining who Sal Petrocelli was and why 4 men had come looking for a confrontation in his shop in the first place, and that kind of explanation tended to draw exactly the kind of attention a small neighborhood barbershop didn't need. He said the story, told carelessly, made his shop sound like the kind of place where things happened. It wasn't that kind of place. It was a place where a man got his hair cut every 2 weeks and talked about his garden. So when customers asked about the small dent in the second barber chair, a detail several regulars noticed over the years and asked about with the casual curiosity of people who've been coming to the same shop for a decade, Vincent would say something vague about a delivery accident or an unruly customer who'd had too much to drink, or simply that he didn't remember exactly. He had several versions, deployed depending on who was asking and how much patience he had that day for the conversation. He told the real version perhaps 4 times in the remaining years of his life, always to people he trusted completely, always with the specific instruction that it wasn't a story to be repeated casually. He said it felt to him like something that belonged in the category of things you witness rather than things you tell, that turning it into neighborhood lore would cheapen something that had actually been, in the room, genuinely remarkable.
Sal Petrocelli, for his part, never discussed the incident with anyone in the neighborhood either, for reasons that required considerably less explanation. He had walked into the wrong shop looking for the wrong man, started a confrontation based on a case of mistaken identity, and ended up on the floor of a barbershop in under a minute at the hands of someone who had, by every account, done nothing to provoke it. There was no version of that story that made for a comfortable telling, and Sal seemed to understand this immediately and completely, because nobody in the neighborhood ever heard him bring it up, not even years later when enough time had passed that most embarrassing stories eventually get told as jokes on oneself. This one never did. The heavy-set man's shoulder, according to a doctor who treated him at a clinic 2 neighborhoods over later that same afternoon, had been dislocated cleanly, the kind of injury that suggested deliberate, controlled technique rather than the chaotic damage of a wild brawl. He told the doctor he'd fallen. Vincent kept the dented chair in his shop for another 6 years until he finally replaced both chairs during a general shop renovation. He said he'd thought about getting it fixed earlier, more than once, and had decided each time to leave it exactly as it was. He said he liked having something in the room that remembered what had happened there, even if he was the only one who knew what it was actually remembering.
If this story reminded you that the most remarkable moments often happen in the most ordinary places, witnessed by people who choose to carry them quietly, share it with someone who needs to hear that today. Subscribe for more stories about the man behind the legend. Because Bruce Lee never went looking for that Tuesday afternoon. It found him, sitting by a window with a newspaper, waiting for an appointment that mattered far less than the 60 seconds that came before it. There's a particular kind of incident that exists in the space between a story worth telling and a story worth keeping. Vincent Russo had run a barbershop for the better part of 4 decades, and in that time he had heard thousands of stories from customers about marriages, money, the small triumphs and disasters of ordinary life. He understood the difference between a story that wanted to be told and one that wanted to be held. This belonged to the second category. His wife, Carol, was the only person who heard the complete account close to when it happened, that same evening. She asked him if he had been frightened. He thought about it before answering. He said there hadn't been time to be frightened. The whole thing was over too quickly. What he felt afterward was something closer to awe, though not at violence. He had seen violence before in that neighborhood, and it had never struck him as something to feel awe about. What struck him was the economy of it, the complete absence of anything wasted. He said it made him reconsider what control actually meant. 11 years later, Vincent discovered by coincidence that the clinic doctor who had treated the heavyset man's dislocated shoulder that same afternoon was also one of his regular customers, a connection neither had realized for over a decade. The doctor said the dislocation had been unusually clean for what the patient claimed was an accidental fall. You could generally tell the difference between an injury produced by chaos and one produced by precision, he said. This had unmistakably been the latter. The 2 men sat together for nearly an hour, comparing what each had known. Vincent said he had wondered early on whether the young man with the newspaper had any idea what he'd actually walked away from, or whether it had genuinely been as unremarkable to him as his expression had suggested. He had decided, eventually, that it probably had been exactly that unremarkable, not because the young man didn't understand what happened, but because he understood it so completely and so calmly that the word remarkable simply didn't apply to him the way it applied to everyone else in the room. Vincent kept that conclusion to himself for the rest of his life, not from fear, from the settled understanding that some things are made smaller by being told too often, and this was not a story he was willing to let become smaller.